Hello, everyone, and welcome to this new episode of Come Together, a joint initiative by the European People's Party and the Wilfried Martin Center for European Studies. Today, we're going to talk about the crisis in Ukraine and the challenges it poses to the EU and in general to the West. A very topical issue and one that has raised more questions and speculation than actual answers. To help provide us with some clarity about this topic, we have the pleasure to have with us Michael Gahler, a German member of the European Parliament and a very close friend of Ukraine, and Professor Constantine Arvanitopoulos, Research Associate at the Martin Center, former Minister of Education of Greece, and currently Professor of International Politics at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy of the Tufts University. Mr. Gahler, Professor, welcome, both of you. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation. So let me start with the question that is on everyone's mind. What is Putin's endgame in Ukraine? Is he really planning a military invasion and so willing also to pay the high price for it? Or is this just another tactical maneuver to provoke, to put pressure on the West so as to have the upper hand on the dossier like energy security that are actually on the table? Maybe Mr. Gahler, would you like to start first?
Yes, thank you very much, and greetings to Boston and to Brussels. Well, if you put the question this way, well, he has already planned the military invasion. He is preparing it. The big question is, will he launch it? And that, apart from Mr. Putin and his very close aides, probably nobody knows. I think the real problem of the issue is that it's, according to my mind, it's in fact not about weaponry or NATO enlargement, but the real issue is that Putin is afraid that Ukraine might be a successful transformation country at some point, where it is not yet, but he would like to prevent it becoming a success story, and that is why he is intimidating. Whether he will go to the implementation of his preparations, we hope not, but that also depends on us, how we behave.
And Professor, maybe you could also develop a little bit more about the broader perspective of the long-term strategic game that Putin is playing?
Yeah. Yes, thank you. I will agree with Mr. Gahler. I think that Putin actually has two objectives. One is a short-term objective, and that has to do with the putting an end to the process of NATO's enlargement and creating again a sphere of influence and buffer zones, which has been a traditional policy of Russia and the Soviet Union in its near abroad. And I think that he can achieve that through a variety of means and ways. One way is by exercising all this pressure, by this bullying, as we can label it, on Ukraine. He can actually launch an incursion. He can proceed to have a partial annexation of Ukraine. I think Putin is testing the waters with the West, and this is not a new development. He has started testing the waters with the West since 2008, with Georgia and then with Crimea. So I think that he is testing the waters. That's his short-term objective, to stop the process of NATO enlargement and the process of the enlargement of the European and Atlantic institutions. And of course, I fully agree with what Mr. Gahler said, that he does not want to see a number of other velvet revolutions close to Russia. I think, however, that he has a long-term objective as well. I think that Putin has never hidden that his aversion, rather, with the post-Cold War settlement. And I think that his long-term objective is to undo this settlement. And we see that from his three-pronged policy that he has developed over the last decade or so. The first cycle of his foreign policy is to restore influence and dominance in his near abroad. The second cycle is for Russia to return to regions that the former Soviet Union exercise traditional power and influence, like the Middle East or the Balkans. And the third cycle, which is a more escalatory cycle, is the Russia's intervention in domestic affairs of our Western republics, so that he can exploit divisions and exacerbate tensions and create chaos. So I think his overall objectives, if we look into all the means that he is using over the last decade or 2 decades, is to undo the post-Cold War settlement. And he's testing the waters, and his perception is that now the West is in decline, that America is weak, especially following the hasty withdrawal from Afghanistan. And I think he's going to try to exploit this, his perceived weakness of the West.
Well, if I may just come in on this, I also agree in principle. My question definitely is, when he, with his long-term perspective now that he is in charge, I really wonder why Russia never manages to, so to say, exercise its interest in a friendly way. I mean, what I wonder, and what is the argument behind why is it that they cannot be friendly to their neighbors and thereby attract attention, become attractive, become perhaps even fascinating, and thereby say, hey, that everybody says, hey, with the Russians, it's great to do job, to do business and to engage. Why is it always the negative way? Have you ever thought about that? I simply cannot see why they couldn't try another way. Actually, what they achieve is by their nastiness, by their brutality, by their invasion and all what they are doing, they are pushing all potential friendly countries or interested countries in the opposite camp. I mean, he provokes now that countries like Sweden and Finland are rising their old discussion that is not normally in the foreground. Now these two countries are discussing NATO membership. So he actually achieves the opposite. Before the invasion in Crimea, there was maximum 25% support for NATO membership of Ukraine. Now it's 60%. So it's somehow, I really wonder, why is it that they are not trying another way to have influence in a positive way?
Which actually brings me to my next question, because basically, what can we do? What can the EU do to protect Ukraine now? So to push Russia to withdraw its troops, but also in general to protect Ukraine for any further threat. And I was wondering, and this is a question for both of you, if you think that what is more effective, the economic sanctions, or as the Ukrainian ask, as the Ukrainian president, a more clear perspective, EU perspective, also NATO perspective for the country, or maybe neither of those. What do you think? Maybe Mr. Gahler would like to continue? Sorry, we don't have your audio.
Sorry. Well, I think what is necessary now is twofold things. We need to stay united in our stance, and united, I mean not only in the EU framework, but also in the transatlantic framework, politically united. And then, of course, we have a certain division of labor. The EU is not a military organization primarily. Or that is for NATO. And within NATO, it's the individual member states who take individual decisions, whether, for instance, to deliver weapons to the Ukrainians. Now we see the US, Britain, the Baltic states. Today I heard about Czech Republic, Canada. They are delivering and or even sending some specialists. Germany is not, I say, unfortunately. But so that is on this side. When it is about clear messages from the EU, I think that is where we are strong, that is in the economic field. And when it comes about visa issues and so on, I think I'm definitely in favor of having the SWIFT mechanism as the very efficient instrument in case, of course, in case of a real invasion, that should be launched. And I mean, we can switch the button off again. I mean, it's not that once it's launched, it would never have its effect again. But if we have it for a while and they see what devastating effect it has, perhaps that would stop any further incursion. But also visa-wise, all those tens of thousands of rich Russians who have their long-term visas from different member states there, and can travel freely and transfer their money to the EU and further afield, that such visas should have to be stopped and cancelled immediately in order to make them very clear that they are in the same, either they opt for this policy of Russia, or they exercise their domestic influence on the regime. That is not the way to act with a neighbor, and also not with us. So these are the things that I see where we should be clearly communicating such messages towards Russia as a preventive measure. We will always remain civil. Even when Russia acts militarily, we stay on the civilian side of measures. Ukraine is not a NATO member. Article 5 doesn't apply, but we should be our utmost to be helpful in order to avoid a real attack.
Professor, your opinion?
Look, I think that the fact that President Biden and the United States was very quick to take the military option off the table, I think has weakened our position, has emboldened Putin. And that leaves us, with a menu of choices that are sort of restricted. And I think I would agree that, number one, we have to have a coordinated regime of harsh sanctions that are going to bite. But most importantly, I think we need to be prepared to take up on Putin's policies in the long run. We have to understand that Russia has become an authoritarian, revisionist great power. I would agree with Mr. Gahler's comment on the predicament of democracy in Russia. Unfortunately, the fact may be that Russia never had prior experience and exposure to democracy, and more importantly, the transition to democracy never worked in Russia. And what we see is that Russia is resorting to great power politics, to realpolitik, to spheres of influence, to the use of force or the threat of the use of force. So we have a new chessboard in front of us. And what is at stake is, the freedom of choice on the part of the countries to choose their way of life, to choose their alliances. This is what is at stake. And we need to be reminded that this was at stake throughout the Cold War. And so we need to be prepared to go against this policy, this Putin's policy for the long run. We have, the things are shifting back to a confrontation, and the West has to do a couple of things. Number one, remain united, and by that I mean that America's pivoting to Asia and its policy of restraint and its hasty withdrawal from Afghanistan has sent the wrong signals to Putin that Europe does not have the same geopolitical importance for the United States. This has to end. I think that we need to have strong transatlantic relations. I think we need to have coordinated policies. I think we need to have a policy of strategic complementarity during this period of time, so that we will deter further adventurist policies on the part of Russia. But we need to brace for the long run. We need to brace for a long struggle with Putin. This is not going to end as it didn't end with Georgia, it didn't end with Crimea, it will not end in Ukraine, whatever the outcome might be. because his long-term policy is to undo the post-Cold War settlement and to deprive those countries from the right to choose and the freedom to choose and the freedom to determine their lives, their political regimes, and their alliances.
Mr. Gahler, so you were nodding a lot, so I guess you agree with the professor long-term analysis. But what do you think if in the end Russia did invade Ukraine? What would happen next? What would the EU and NATO and US reaction be?
I mean, there is a wise saying: one knows how to start a war, but it's harder to end it. So there may really be unforeseen events. I mean, if such a worst case scenario would happen, I mean, it's not the Ukrainian army of 2014. They are definitely stronger, and they are better equipped, and I think also better motivated than in 2014. So it will be a real fight, a real struggle, and whatever if our countermeasures don't have an effect, I would wish that switching off SWIFT and an immediate, so to say, paralysis of Russian the economy, if that were an argument to stop, if that still failed, I'm really afraid that a lot of nervousness will also be happening along the borders with the Baltic states. We don't know how, for instance, the Belarusian population would react. And even, I mean, they are staging their maneuvers as we speak in Belarus, close to the Ukrainian border, joint Belarusian Russian maneuvers. If there were an internationalization beyond, so to say, another worst case that Belarus was involved from the Russian side, and I wouldn't really like to think anything further. But what we would have to plan for is, I mean, we have already, since the occupation of Crimea and Donbass and Lugansk, we have around 1.5 million internally displaced people in Ukraine. I've always argued, if there is a real attack and marching on, the next millions of Ukrainians will not be hosted inside Ukraine, but they will pour into the European Union to be safe. I cannot imagine that millions of Ukrainians would like to live under such a, almost said Soviet, under such a Russian occupation. You can imagine if they were successful, the Russians, that would really cause a guerrilla war inside the country, that would really cause the worst imaginable retaliations of Russian occupying forces in all areas where there would be resistance. And that would be, I mean, really horrifying to think of. And so I hope that such escalation would then still not happen, because our sanctions and our reaction would be successful at an early stage.
That's all. But Professor, coming back to you, what do you think that this crisis say about our own foreign security and defense policy, and also the fact that the EU is basically excluded from the talks about the security architecture in Europe? What do you think it says about us?
Look, I think that this crisis unavoidably brings back to the table the discussion on the issue of Europe's strategic autonomy, on Europe's strategic compass, and its defense policy in total. And I think, look, we need to continue this process of discussions, and we need to have an end with these discussions and decide for the defensive scheme that we will adopt. But in the meantime, I use the term strategic complementarity. Look, Europe for many years throughout the Cold War was characterized in terms of defense by its dependence upon the United States, right? And now we went to the other end of the pendulum, and we are talking about strategic autonomy. We all know that this is a process that will take time to reach to. So in the meantime, I think we need a policy of strategic complementarity. We need a new charter with the United States, a new division of labor. We need to contribute more for our defense and military expenditures. We need to take up more responsibilities and missions. We need to participate in the decision-making process. We need to strengthen our defense capability and our defense identity, European defense identity. This, I think, for this transitional period of time, will have to do in coordination with the United States, within the process of the Atlantic institutions, in a scheme that I have characterized as strategic complementarity. But there is no point of arguing against the process of establishing a distinct European defensive capability. The world is resorting back, unfortunately, is resorting back to the tragedy of great power politics, is resorting back to, realpolitik, Machtpolitik, and spheres of influence and the use of force and so on and so forth. So Europe, I believe that Europe has to be a player in the international system, but in order to be a player in the international system, you have to strengthen your strategic capabilities, your defensive identity.
We seem to be agreeing on everything, so it's not a real controversial discussion. I have always argued that this sometimes this term strategic autonomy is perceived by those who want to perceive it that way as something that would be directed against NATO or complementing the US out of Europe. I think that is by no means, it should not be by no means be the objective, but it's about how to define the strategic autonomy. For instance, for me, it has two aspects. On the one hand, it's the industrial aspect. I would like to be in a position as Europeans that we have an industrial base for our capability development, where we can supply ourselves to a large extent through cooperating and getting our industries in a more efficient and competitive situation. So autonomy industry-wise, that we are not depending on each and every part of our armament even on friends. And the other thing is, for me, autonomous in case NATO is not available. I mean, we have seen, well, in Afghanistan, NATO was available and had to be available because we Europeans wouldn't have been able to organize our withdrawal in an orderly way had there not been the Americans. Now, in the Sahel, in Mali, if we needed to leave, I'm afraid the Americans are not there to help us out. So we would have to autonomously be able to have the capabilities to do it on our own. Or the other aspect, when NATO is blocked, what if something happens in Bosnia? And that is perhaps more likely than recently than we have thought in the last years. And what if we would have, as European Union, to take recourse to NATO resources, and a NATO member, Mr. Erdogan, says, no, I don't want that. I have other ideas for Bosnia than you. Then NATO is blocked. So for such cases, we would have to be autonomously able still to do what we have to do on the ground in Bosnia, or be it Libya. I mean, it was also part of the Ottoman Empire. Perhaps Mr. Erdogan has other ideas for that if need arises. We would say we would have to go, and NATO was blocked. So that is how I define the strategic autonomy. And so to say, for our purposes, if we have no access to NATO, complementarity fits into that. Having a stronger European pillar through our policy now with industrial policy in the defense sector, I think that helps us, makes us stronger. And globally seen, I think I very much like this notion, in the light of Russia, but also of China. I like this notion of this alliance of democracies, that in the areas of trade, global trade, and global security, all democracies should really find closer together in order to face the bad guys of the world.
Just as a complement to your answer, a professor mentioned the strategic compass, which we know is the priority also of the French presidency of the EU. Do you think it's enough to provide a basis for a more independent security and defense policy, or does it need some improvement still?
Well, I think one aspect is of the strategic compass is, of course, a common threat assessment. And I think unwillingly, Mr. Putin has contributed actively that we come to more common views on what really is a danger for us. And it's definitely not only Russia, there are others, but the Russian aspect is a bit denied or neglected by some of our partners. But the current I think the current development helps us to further strengthen and broaden the common understanding of what is threatening us. And then from this common assessment, I hope that we will now go step by step, not everything at the same time. And although I'm one of those initiators of all that now led to a European Defence Fund. We were starting with a little project in 2015 in the budget. But my point to say is that we should now take the next step and say, okay, if there is a rapid deployment force of, say, 5,000 that would be established in case of need, and then I'm thinking not so much of Ukraine or Russia, but for instance of Bosnia, because Altea is perhaps not ready in its standby function. I would wish that we would have something, but not ad hoc, but permanently based. Why should not member states provide soldiers, 5,000, a brigade size, that is permanently stationed, that is permanently training, that is permanently having its English courses so that we understand each other, and is getting supplies of the best materials that we have got on our European market. That is my way to further develop a strategic compass from a threat analysis to becoming operational and able to act if need arises.
Okay, thank you. If a professor doesn't want to react further or have another comment, then I would like to conclude. So basically, from what I understand, Putin is pushing us together and pushing Eastern Partnership country toward us. So everything for the best. But so thank you very much for your time, both of you. Thank you for your useful insight. It's a complicated situation. I hope we helped give some clarity. And thanks in general for the work you're doing in the European Parliament and in the Martin Center. As for our viewers, thank you very much also for tuning in to this episode of Come Together. And please join us again for the next episode, which will come out soon. Goodbye.
Thank you.